Alright, so welcome everyone to today's discussion. We're going to be looking into a rather interesting topic today, which is how to make your own Ancerious lore. And within that, we're going to be looking at, what is Ancerious lore, what differentiates it from standard individual faction lore. We're going to look at some examples of famous Ancerious lore and concepts, how they came about, etc., how to create and develop your own concepts, both in character and out of character, how to organically integrate your concepts into Ancerious proper as a group, how to maintain interest of other players and hype for your concepts, what is Ancerios' prehistory and how you can potentially write for it, how to make your own faction lore into Ancerious lore and vice versa, and then how to not do any of the above, and general questions. So, the first thing is, what is Ancerious lore and what differentiates it from faction lore? Well, to start off with, what is faction lore? Well, you as players come into Ancerious as a group, and naturally you're going to be playing your own factions. Now, your own factions are going to have their own histories, they're going to have their own cultures, they're going to have their own governments, characters, militaries, and storylines. And all of these are obviously going to be sort of like marginally self-contained, although we'll get on to obviously how to make it much more integrated with the group later on. But your faction in itself is kind of a mini setting from which you can tell stories, yeah? So Ancerious lore, by comparison, is all of the information and the background and the lore for the Ancerious galaxy. What's the overall galactic culture like? What are the majority of the galaxy's people like? What's the overall political situation like? What is its history like? What's happened? What are major characters in Ancerious as a whole like? And obviously, what are all the different storylines and plot hooks that are going on in the wider galaxy proper? So that's kind of the difference. Ancerious lore is the kind of like really big overarching bubble that encompasses the group, while the individual faction lore is going to be sort of mostly your own creations in a sort of little bubble where you can sort of, sculpt. Think about it as like you've got a tiny little piece of a greater whole. That's your faction, and the greater whole is the group. Now, obviously, there's going to be certain factions that are definitely more kind of Ancerious lore focused rather than individual. For instance, NPCs or particular factions that the admins write. The Army of the Panopticon, for example, is not necessarily a faction in terms of faction lore. It's more of a greater part of Ancerios' sort of story, etc. But as kind of these things are usually more towards the story aspect rather than anything else. So using this, we'll go into some examples of, Ancerious lore / concepts, how they came about, and what they are. So obviously I brought up the Army of the Panopticon, so we might as well start with that. The Army of the Panopticon started as a throwaway line in one of my own factions called the Grand Empire of Capital. And it started as a psionic combat unit. Now, this kind of over time developed from, it would be cool if during Capital's collapse they kind of escape and maybe become a minor faction or something that, maybe we could do a few plot lines with and do some funky, psionic behind the scenes stuff. Well, as you can probably tell, that naturally developed. And we thought, well, we've got these cool characters that we've developed for the Army of the Panopticon. Why don't we just kind of roll with it so that they're in the background becoming this big threat? We just created the psionic lore and the background for the group at the time. And it was like, well, the Army of the Panopticon would be a really good avenue to help flesh that out and solidify it. This then turned them into a bit more of a threat. We then came up with the idea that, well, maybe they could be the next sort of like big galactic threat. Maybe they could be the next big plot line. And this kind of organically developed into the, galactic threat that they are today. Now, obviously, yes, they are a faction, and they originated from one of my factions, but they're not just sort of my faction to run. The Army of the Panopticon are a group-wide plot hook, effectively. They're there for other players to also interact with and create plot hooks from. So that's kind of one example of like a crazy little thing that started out as literally just a throwaway couple sentences in the Grand Empire of Capital Nation sheet, and is now probably one of the biggest plot lines in the group history, period. Another example is Lost Star. Now, Lost Star was, again, kind of created when I decided that, well, maybe Ancerious needs some galactic locations, places of note, which could lead to some cool stories and player interaction. And I thought, well, what about an asteroid base, which is a complete den of, scum and villainy, loads of pirates are there, maybe factions can deal there outside of international law, etc. And it just kind of developed into this, place where loads of people went to. The factions inside of Lost Star developed, like White Maginot, the House of Asterion, etc. They were sort of fleshed out just as and when we thought of a cool idea. And then when Second Ancerious War happens, we thought, well, it would be quite cool to do some stuff with Lost Star. This then developed into the Pirate War, and all of the pirates and the sort of like scum and villainy being kicked off of Lost Star being destroyed, and then the Triple Ring World being built in its place by all of the, super well-indebted individuals that have wealth and power, and wanted to see this kind of like unofficial galactic meeting ground turn into more or less the unofficial galactic capital of the galaxy. And this has then created a pretty much perfect setting for any kind of roleplay you can imagine, especially character-driven roleplay. We've had loads of plots go off of Lost Star. We've run tabletop groups off of Lost Star, IGT especially. And it's just been a really great well of just being like, hey, I want to run this plot line. Well, okay, where do you want to run it? Well, we can do Lost Star because it's an easy option. Yeah, it was an example of Ancerious lore being created to be a tool for other players to use for their own benefit. Another example, although I can't really speak for these entirely because they're Victor's sort of plot lines, but Palm Rashidia and sort of Mai started out as funky sort of like NPC factions that then got developed through sort of lore, roleplay being brought up in the sidelines and whatnot, and they kind of developed into their own cool background factions that players can obviously include and use in different like lore and stuff. Both of those really got developed alongside the period where we decided to integrate a lot more NPCs into the galaxy, because we wanted the galaxy to feel lived in. We wanted it to feel like, hey, you could pick any section of the galaxy, look in there, and you can see NPC factions, nations that have been around for a while, or maybe not a while, and they have links to each other, they have links to other factions, they have some plot hooks. Players can take that and run with it, yeah? So we've got these sort of... I guess another one, really good one, would be the Old Invaders. The Old Invaders are kind of like another one of these galactic threats that originated alongside this big list of NPCs that we made. And I created them as a throwaway sort of NPC. Oh, there were these mysterious von Neumann probes approaching from outside the galaxy and sort of terrorizing people. Oh, spooky, I wonder where they could be from. And in my mind, I kind of had the idea of like, well, what if they do come from outside the Ancerious galaxy? And then I decided to kind of use them in a few plots inside of Farreach, where, the players were interacting with new areas in the Galactic Halo, where they could be a legitimate issue because they come from outside the galaxy. And that's where this kind of idea that, like, well, the Old Invaders are actually kind of like this kind of threat, they're a bit shit, but they've got this threatening demeanour. You know, like, where do they come from? And then this got integrated into the whole thing of, we thought, well, wouldn't it actually be cool if they did come from another galaxy? And what if there was another galaxy and its Overmind was alive and there was this like big scary thing that's going on, and it's kind of like one of the possible last bosses for the Ancerious group and like all this other stuff. So we kind of then like revealed stuff to the players and like did fun things, and that kind of got really fleshed out in Corona and in some of the sort of like Hyperia's or Outer Halo RPs. But yeah, again, a throwaway thing that then got turned into something pretty major, just on a whim, really. So these are like kind of key examples where people have thought like, oh, let's create this either as a tool for other players to use that has then been used and turned into greater Ancerious group like lore, or throwaway lines that have then been picked up by somebody and then turned into greater Ancerious group lore. Some other good examples would be like stuff in the Unmar Expanse and some of the other like smaller regions where players have been interacting with NPCs and sort of taking them, fleshing them out, developing them, and having a bit of like an integrated plot line going on in those regions. That's been really cool to see, and that's the kind of thing that, you know, we want to see from most people, really. You know, nobody's asking you to intricately weave everything into everything, but, you know, using these kind of tools is really useful, and we'll sort of get onto that in a bit. So this kind of leads obviously into the question of, well, you know, how do you create your concepts in character and out of character? And, you know, the very simple discussion ending thing is, well, you just write them, mate. There you go. Welcome to my TED Talk. Thanks for coming. But obviously there's a lot to it than that. If you have an idea in Ancerious, and obviously I know a few people in this chat are new to Ancerious, and you're probably just like, oh, you know, how do I actually create something that's going to be interesting here? You know, how am I going to create something that's going to have an impact here? Well, it's going to seem daunting, but it's actually way easier than you think. So it's daunting because there's very little that hasn't been done in Ancerious to some degree, shape or form, especially if it's like an NPC or something. So the best bet is just to come in and be like, look, I've got this idea, this is my plan for my faction or my plot line or my idea, or, you know, whatever that is that you're creating. What do people think? Now, inevitably, somebody's going to come along, Victor, and is going to say, oh, that's been done before in X sort of fashion, by X faction or Y plotline or whatever, yeah? Now, don't take that as like, oh, well, I won't do that then. Don't do that. Because there are plenty of examples of stuff that has been done before, but then has been done again, but differently. And this is where the whole concept of, like, special source comes in. These are kind of buzzwords used in Ancerious, yeah? And the best way of putting special source out there is what makes your idea unique from other ideas that can be like it. You could have 3 democratic socialist nations that are all, on paper, exactly the same, but special source is what differentiates them all from each other and makes them unique, yeah? Special source is basically what makes somebody go like, oh yeah, that's from that nation, or that's from that plotline, or that's from that idea. Now, obviously, you can't just conjure special source into thin air. Sadly, it's not as easy as that. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. But the key is to ask, and if it's been done before, ask about it. Ask, like, okay, what faction's done it? Can you give me some background, as if to, like, tell me what's been done in that regard, who's done it, maybe ping the player who's done it in question, and they can, like, work stuff out with you, because maybe you can tie in your plotline to something regarding that in character. Oh, well, maybe your nation is like X's nation. but there's possibly a reason for that you could then tie in, and that can then immediately, once you get into RP, lead to some cool potential plot lines that allow you to RP with that player, or, you know, leads to some individual funky stories, yeah? A really good example of this is a lot of people come in and they're just, I want to create a communist nation. That's cool, like, no problem. However, have you considered tying your communist nation lore into stuff like the Peony Revolution lore, which is all about the natives of the galaxy being exposed to left-wing ideology from the colonial nations and developing and sort of having their own revolution, communist revolution. It got put down in the end. However, there are remnants from that Peony Revolution, nations that survive, nations that kind of like are still trying to keep the torch going, etc. And you can then tie it into that and immediately give yourself ties to other Peony Revolution nations and potential RPs that are going on with that, because there's going to be a second Peony Revolution soon, but you didn't hear it from me. So, you know, ask about things out of character, and people will tell you what's been done, what hasn't been done, or will give you interesting links to other things, yeah? So you might be like, oh, well, I've got this idea for X thing, but somebody might be like, that doesn't really work here. However, you could try this, which is similar and also quite interesting, yeah? So Ancerious is not kind of one of those places where you can just bring in a concept and just sort of like dump it from the box into the setting. The best way is to try and ask around, you know, like, oh, well, I would like to be in this region of the galaxy. Are there any major plot lines or like things that are going on there that I could potentially tie into? Give yourself as many tie-ins as possible. And this kind of also ties into the next thing, which is how to organically integrate your concepts into Ancerious. If you give yourself as much background tie-in as possible to different arcs, to different stories, to different Ancerious lore, like in the past history, you will have a way easier time of both getting into the roleplay and sort of like hitting the ground running, so to say, because you can immediately play off of those links without problems. But also, your concepts are much, much sturdier, yeah? For example, if somebody joins the group and comes in with their nation, and they're playing a native nation that has links to the Peony Revolution, maybe some ongoing stuff in the Unmar, has some potential links to Natar, possibly, through some like old trade deals or whatnot, and has stuff going on, and then they immediately start role-playing and doing some like diplomacy with different players, they've already got a massive foundation to be like, right, I've got links here, 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 and here. I can pursue any of those in RP and develop a story right from the get-go. Also, if anyone asks like, oh, who are those people? You could just be like, oh, well, they're these guys and they're tied to this or whatnot. And it also helps players kind of get a grasp of what your nation is and who it's kind of like tied to. Not necessarily in regards to like, oh, well, you're under Natar's umbrella, for example, with blue, but like you can start associating that faction with other factions, and that kind of helps build up an image by sort of support, you know. But if somebody comes into the group and says, you know, oh, well, I've got this colonial nation, and they have no links whatsoever to any of the ongoing plot lines. They've only just turned up, so they have no links to any of the native stuff or past things that have happened. And, you know, they don't really trust anyone, and they don't have any outgoing relations. You're going to have a much harder time jumping into the roleplay and building up a foundation than you will if you try to integrate. Now, of course, you can play a colonial and already have relations and do stuff like that, but I'm just saying that it's a lot harder when you don't give yourself those organic integrations into the plot line, yeah? By asking, as we said, out of character about different ideas, what they could be linked to, asking for help in regards to, you know, developing things, coming up with interesting source, etc. Because you can effectively make it way easier on yourself because you don't have to develop these initial roleplay plot hooks because they're already there for you. One of the main problems that I find is that new players to Ancerious join the group and then they kind of go like, okay, what do I do now? I don't really know what to do roleplay wise. I don't really know what to do story wise. I don't really know what I'm meant to be doing. Well, you're meant to be telling a story, obviously, and you're meant to be having fun. But you can't tell stories and you can't have fun telling those stories if there's no hooks for you to immediately be like, huh, what do I do? Yeah? Because if you've got those old trade deals to Natar, if you've got those political ties to other nations in X area of the galaxy, or you've already got sort of political intrigue happening both within your nation and with other NPCs going on, you can pursue those. You could immediately ask Blue, for example, for a diplomacy RP and be like, hey, I said in my nation's history that there was dealings with Natar. Could we do a diplomacy RP where, my people want to strengthen those or, cut those or do something along those lines? Immediately you have a roleplay that can go on and that you can start doing with Blue. Or, I want to do something more politically because there's stuff going on within my area of the galaxy. Boom, you have a way in because your nation's been there for a while. You now have a casus belli, so to say, to jump into those role plays or whatever. Or if you've got internal affairs that are going on that are causing issues and have been going on for a while with ties to other nations, you can immediately run your own role play and be like, right guys, there's some political nefariousness going on within my nation. Would anyone like to join? And people will. And they'll hop in and they'll have good fun. So, yeah, it's way easier to do that than come in and then kind of wait. Because at the end of the day, people are only going to interact with your nation if they find it interesting and they have reason to do so. And if they don't, they're not really going to interact with you. So, again, if you're joining the group and you're not creating these organic integrations into the plotline, you're going to have to build those from scratch the moment you jump into the RP by joining some new player role plays, obviously, and then trying to build ties with other players through that, and then doing it that way. And it can be done. I'm not saying if you choose the route where you've got no integrated connections, there's nothing you can do. We've had plenty of players come in and just sort of dive in. It just means that you need to put more effort in initially to start getting into stories and getting stuff tied to your nation, and then players jumping in and getting involved, etc. It just means it's a little bit more difficulty, and at the end of the day, obviously, we want it to be easy for people so that they can sort of hit the ground running and not have any problems. So that's really how you sort of organically integrate your concepts. And obviously, the kind of easy one is just bring other people in on it. People like developing shit. Bring it up in Gen Dev if you've got ideas or concepts, and people will give their input. And maybe you don't like some of that input. That's fine. You don't have to roll with it. But if you have other people working on something alongside yourself, they're going to have much more connection and attachment to it. Yeah. For example, I'm not going to have a lot of interest in some sort of magic system, for example, that somebody creates that I've had directly no input or interaction with, if that makes sense. So if then somebody comes to me and goes like, "Oh, Marek, have you done anything with this magic system that these few players have been doing?" I'll be like, "No, I haven't even heard of it because I haven't been asked or I haven't interacted with it in any way." But if somebody's opened it up to the server and been like, "Hey guys, I'm creating this thing, or what do you all think of it?" And then people ping me or whoever and go like, "Oh, what do you think of it?" And I'll be like, "Oh, okay, I'll give it a read and give you some feedback." And then when it gets brought up later, I'll be like, "Oh yeah, it'll be that one thing that got brought up and I can remember some stuff about it." So don't sort of keep to yourself in that regard as well. Try to get other players involved. I know that this is sort of obvious given it's a cooperative writing group, but I know that like 99% of players in this group have like crippling social anxiety problems, so understandable, it's all okay. You know, everyone here is fine. If you don't want to overload yourself, you don't have to, but don't be afraid of putting stuff in the chats and asking for feedback, or asking if people want to be involved in it, because at the end of the day, like, they're going to want to be involved. Players want content. Everyone likes content. The worst that can happen is Victor calls your idea gayer than it's already been done before, in which case you just ignore him, or you ask him, okay, how has this been done before? Explain it to me. And he'll give you a massive lore dump exposition, in which case it's up to you to, you know, basically interpret the ancient texts and come up with some mystical way to do anything with it. So yeah, have fun on that one, or you don't get any answer at all, in which case just ping me or someone else, and you know, we'll help you. So yeah, that's kind of like how to develop your concepts but also organically integrate them. Obviously, if you want to develop your concepts in character, you're going to have to roleplay. You know, you're going to have to get in there. And Ancerious is one of those groups where you don't have to, like, constantly put energy and time into it if you don't want to. But it's also a group where the more you put in, the more you get out. So you can't expect your nation to become the best all-powerful in the galaxy if you've only done 2 roleplays and nobody really knows about you, you know? But if you are jumping into the deep end, doing lots of role plays, interacting with loads of players, getting involved in major plot lines, you are going to get seen, and your nation is going to become quite well known. And as thus, there's going to be lots of role play involving it and involving your characters. You'll get to develop it a lot more, and it will organically, through storylines and the actions of, you know, the main plots, multiple players, yourself, and just the group as a whole, will develop and integrate it into the lore, because you will have participated effectively. So, moving on to the next bit. How to maintain interest and hype for your concepts. So, this is quite a difficult one, because obviously you're kind of going to have to, like, get involved with other people for that. You know, you can't sort of ghost the group for 8 months, barely do any role play, and then come in and go like, man, who's stoked for my Civil War art, guys? And everyone's kind of like, who are you? What Civil War? What are you on about? Like, nobody's going to care. But if you're going to want to try to get interest, talk to people, get players involved, and discuss it in the gen devs and public chats. People will get interested. They'll catch wind of it and be like, "Oh, that's a cool idea. Like, yeah, I'll get involved in that Civil War. That sounds fun." And then you can brainstorm with them and just come up with different ideas. And you'll find that other players' ideas for your own stories and concepts are often just as good, if not better, than your own. And you can integrate that. And you can tell them that you're going to integrate that. And that will get them hyped, because they've just contributed to your own plotline. And that's a reward for them. And they get to see that happen, yeah? One of the main things that got players super hyped for Corona, for example, our big flagship plotline, more or less, was the fact that player actions were directly resulting in risk-reward, you know. Players did something particularly brash. They might get rewarded for it, or they might completely get mind obliterated off the face of the galaxy. Either way, they knew that their actions and their inputs were going to have a really cool effect on the storyline and get a result. Therefore, they were hyped for it, because they couldn't wait to find out what happened. In this same regard, you can keep people interested by obviously keeping the topic relevant, and by keeping the plotline going at a decent pace. You don't want to obviously, you know, bog role plays down with like long posting times and whatnot. I'm not saying that that can't happen and people, you know, won't be interested. You know, real life happens plenty, and you know, sometimes there's long posts and whatnot. But keep it going relatively well. And drop hints now and again. If people are like clearly interested in something you're doing, drop some little hints now and again. You know, just feed them a bit of a morsel, and they'll get hyped up. They'll hype themselves up. Like half of Corona and the Mortal Coil arc with the Panopticon is me and Victor just dropping the occasional hints of like stuff happening, and people get hyped for it. Or the super weapon exchange that's going to come on the 2nd of January. Where, you know, I've been like, oh man, like a load of systems are getting destroyed, and everyone's like, ooh, you know, just keep people hyped by dropping morsels, keep people involved, keep things going at a decent pace, yeah, and just get out there, get yourself known to other players, because if I hear in a chat that like X person is doing a plot line, and I've barely seen them interact on the roleplay server, and I barely see them talk in the main server, I'm not going to be hyped personally, because I don't really know them. So I don't know if their story's going to be good or not. I don't know if I'm going to take my time to read it, because I know I run Ancerious. I don't have the time to look at absolutely everything. But, you know, if there's a lot of work being done by that person to do this particular plot line, like they're doing some art for it, they've done a load of write-ups for it, they've talked about it in like a load of the gen devs, a load of the people have gotten involved, a load of the players, including some of the admins, and I see people talking about it a lot, I'll be like, oh, a lot of people seem hyped for this and interested. I'll check it out and, you know, have a read of it and see what's going on. And sort of the hype and the interest will then perpetually generate itself and drag more people into it, is pretty much the case, you know? So that's kind of how you maintain that for your concepts. Obviously try not to sort of do the rocks fall, everyone dies, or don't railroad, or don't kind of cut players off from having an influence on your creations, because that will kill hype and interest really, really quickly. Case in point, Civil Wars, I bring them up a lot. They're quite an overdone plot line, but they're a firm favourite with everyone. Key in point, you get everyone hyped up for this Civil War, and players are backing different factions, and they're, you know, trying to have an influence on your faction and your plotline, because there's lots of different interesting characters involved. Well, if you've already decided what faction wins the Civil War, well, there's no real, like, major things that players can do to affect that outcome. And if that means that, like, 3 players came up with an idea where they could get their faction to win in a way that you didn't foresee, and you turn around and go, oh, well, that actually doesn't work, or you kind of, like, put them down on the spot, that will make them feel put down, and it will kind of make them lose interest, because it's like, oh, well, you know, we thought we were going to do a really cool thing here, and that's just been kind of taken from us. You've got to be sort of well-versed in... Huh. That was interesting.
What the fuck?
No, did everyone else just get kicked out?
Yeah. Okay. Discord problems. Interesting.
Who do we blame?
That was
blame
Lycos.
Myro.
Sorry, Paradolia. Paradolia moment.
Who are you?
Oh, the wave finally reached us.
That was Paradolia causing that. So, right, where was I? Civil Wars, yes. So, rewarding players for their inputs and actions into your plotline is extremely worthwhile. And yes, they're probably going to outthink you, because players always do. As a DM, I can tell you now, players will outthink you at every possible corner, because they have way more chromosomes than you. Remember that. Because of that, if they do something that you haven't foreseen, and that changes your plans, if you try to railroad them back to that original plan, it can seem to them like you're putting them down. Like, their time and energy was not worth it. Okay? And there is nothing worse than thinking that you're doing something really cool in a roleplay that's going to have a crazy outcome than have it being effectively shut down immediately and being told, oh no, sorry, that can't happen. There is nothing worse, because I've had that as a player in D&D and in like role plays before, and it makes me lose interest almost immediately. Yeah, so if you're going to role play here and you're going to have story ideas and you're going to have faction ideas, get players involved. Don't punish them, and don't sort of like stick stuff in concrete if you want to maintain hype and interaction. Yeah, I know this kind of like links back to the last discussion on like how to run your own arcs and stuff, but this all kind of does tie into one another. So yeah, you're not going to maintain hype if you do that sort of thing. So next sort of bit is, what is Ank's prehistory and how can I write for it? So one of the things that a lot of people want to do and like to do is they like to read the Ancerious kind of like ancient history. Yeah, like, hey, what happened before the modern era, or what happened before I joined the group? And they'll have a read through it, and then they'll think to themselves like, oh man, this is some really cool story. I wonder if I could write for it, or, you know, influence it in any way. And the answer is you can, but obviously writing for pre-established stuff is something that we only allow players that we trust. Because, you know, obviously if somebody then decides to write, well, actually, my nation was a super massive giga ancient power back in the day, pre-modern history, and they controlled like 90% of the galaxy, and they were giga chads, and they did all of this stuff. And it's like, well, okay, but why hasn't that ever come up before? And who the fuck are you? You know, like, nobody's gonna really care. So the key thing is, with the Ancerious prehistory, don't be afraid to link your nation or storylines to stuff that has previously happened, okay? Because it's still cool, it still happened, it's still stuff that you can link and use as story potential. But be careful when you do so, and definitely emphasise the talking out of character to other players or admins about it, yeah? Definitely, if you want to link your nation to some sort of ancient faction, definitely ping the admins and be like, hey, I want my guys to be the descendants of maybe one of the you know, species of a particular fragment or something, that are long sort of ancestors or whatnot. Like, okay, we can discuss it, we can talk about ideas, and we can potentially make it canon. That's something we can do. But, you know, don't sort of run into the prehistory and just sort of run wild, yeah? We don't want you to write a 10-page document and then us kind of like review it and be like, oh, this doesn't really work or conflicts with like known lore or whatever. And, you know, if you'd have just asked us, we could have told you that and you wouldn't have had to waste all your time. So you could definitely write for ancient lore or tie yourselves into old lore. Just the whole thing of like how to organically develop your ideas is kind of a lot stricter and a lot more necessary here. Again, obviously we don't just sort of let anyone jump into the old timeline and be like, well, hey, and write funky stuff. I know probably in this coming year we're going to be solidifying the, not Overmind era, but sort of like post-Overmind era to modern era events, timeline, and sort of like what happened, etc. There's obviously going to be quite a bit of leeway in that. Players are quite happy to give their input into that. But, you know, don't feel like you can never influence these sort of like pre-established stuff. You can, and you can absolutely say, hey, my nation is a native nation. It's been here since before the start of the modern era, but, you know, it's mostly been keeping to itself or doing its own stuff. You could do that. Obviously, you'll probably want to give decent reasons for, what was your nation doing in the First Ancerios War? What was your nation doing during the Peony Revolution? What was your nation doing in the Second Ancerios War, or the Boreal Jihad, or the Age of Disorder, or the Third Ancerios War? As long as you have ways to explain this, or even link in with those established story arcs and ask, hey, what happened in 2AW? I would like to have a little bit of a link to it. Like DCOM, for example, had the Herschels, be invaded and screwed over by the Grand Empire of Capital. And that was one of his big tie-ins. And it's, these things of, you're more than welcome to integrate your stories in. And they're a fantastic treasure trove for, creating these organic links to potential story foundations that you can, again, just sort of hit the ground running when you get into the group. So, don't feel like you can't ever influence Ancerios's lore in terms of what's already happened. You can, just obviously you can't change what's already happened, if that makes sense. So, yeah, as long as you don't go silly with it, and as long as you happily talk to us admins and staff first, you won't have a problem, and we're quite happy to hear you out and help you develop stuff. So, how to make faction lore into Ankh lore and vice versa. So I think we've kind of already sort of gone over this over the last sort of few sections, but your faction lore is your own section of world building. Yeah, that's your kind of your piece of a greater whole, so to say. And when you join the group, that piece of the greater whole is kind of like initially all you have to sculpt. You sculpt this piece of the puzzle, and in order to turn that sort of piece of the puzzle into Ankh lore, you need to put it into the greater puzzle, and to do that, you need to give it connections, you need to give it foundations, you need to work with other players, you need to role play. And in time, your nation will stop being sort of its own self-contained story and will become a greater whole in the plotline and the greater Ancerios lore proper. And there's been kind of a few cases, especially with my nations, where my nations have gone from being kind of, their own self-contained thing, and to kind of being a more background story element, really. They're not there for me to actively play as a conventional role player. They're more there for me and others to use as a story element for particular plot lines or whatnot. Or for people to write specific things, yeah? And, in time, you might find that your faction, after many years of role-playing, you like it, but you want change, you want different stuff to happen. And you just open it up to people. You start doing funky things that you never thought you'd do before, like, throwing it into civil war, or having it lose a massive battle or conflict, and, you have leadership change and civil change and all this sort of things, and maybe it fractures and turns into lots of different political groups or whatnot, each allowing you to write a new sort of a way of looking at things from inside that faction. So there comes a time when your nation becomes well known enough in the galaxy for other players to easily incorporate elements of it into stories. So, for example, again, we'll use Natar. Natar has kind of solidified itself as like, yes, it's Blue's faction, and he has plenty of faction lore, but Natar is now as much Ancerios lore as it is anything else, because they're kind of like the main galactic economic sort of situation, yeah? So loads of stories and such are going to have like mentions of them, or Telerans themselves involved, or Blue involved himself in the story, for example. So it's kind of a case of you can take these factions and just turn them into a greater whole. And you can also do it vice versa. You can take a piece of Ankh lore and you can turn it into a faction. For example, any one of you could look at the NPC sheet choose one entry and go, this sounds cool. I want to turn this into something. And you could come to us and you can obviously say in one of the gen devs, hey guys, has anyone done anything with the, I don't know, like whatever Dominion or whatnot? In which case, maybe someone might go like, oh yeah, I have, I've mentioned them in a role play, or like, oh, they're an antagonist in this particular story that I'm running, or like, oh no, we haven't done anything for it. In which case you could be like, okay, well, I'm going to try and turn them into something more. I want to flesh them out. I want to turn them into an actual faction. I want to go in detail from this kind of like nebulous cloud of what they could potentially be in the Ankh lore, and go in and figure out their culture, their politics, their military, their characters, how they do things, etc. And do it on a much smaller level. And in which case, you know, again, you can work with players who have already kind of like done bits and pieces for them, and then you can patch that in and work it, and then you can just build it from the ground up, get other players involved. Again, people will be interested. This will then lead to plot lines. It will then lead to you, you know, running this as a faction, and you can then just sort of take it off from there. So don't be afraid to do that sort of stuff, you know. A lot of the NPCs have been turned into pretty major things just from somebody going like, oh, that's cool, I'll do some stuff for that, you know. So, you know, you make your faction into Anklor by just working with others, working in the roleplay, and just keeping on top of sort of like interacting with the community and getting people hyped and interested. And you turn Anklor into faction lore by taking already done NPCs or ideas that have been floated around in the group and fleshing it out in detail, again with other people, and just sort of creating something on a smaller scale but that's much more fleshed out. So I guess the next bit is how not to do any of the above. Well, I've kind of already touched on this. Obviously, you're never going to integrate your concepts, you're never going to get people hyped or interested, and you're never going to develop anything if you just kind of sit on your own in the corner of the sandbox doing nothing. You know, it's all well and good saying that you've got an isolationist nation that's super military and xenophobic or whatever, but how is that going to get you involved in the roleplay? Yeah? You've got to think, how are you going to interact? How are you going to get those foundational plot hooks? How are you going to start interacting in the roleplay and giving yourselves these hooks that you can then pursue to interact with multiple different people? If you make it hard for other players to interact with you, they're not going to interact with you because it's a chore or it's going to be hard. And then they're not going to be interested in your stuff because, like, why am I going to be interested in an empire that won't do anything and won't get involved in any of the plot lines? That's just basically like background Anklor at that point. You know, that's no different than a one-sentence NPC on the sheet. Sure, you might have a massive faction sheet for them and you've got shitloads of stuff fleshed out for them, but that's never going to be shown in the roleplay because nobody can roleplay with you. So, you know, don't cut yourself off from other players. Don't cut yourself off from the admins, because, please, it never ends well. People think, like, oh yeah, I could do this cool idea, and then they, you know, bring out a 20-page document, and then we go, yeah, dude, that's already been done in this instance. If you'd have just talked to us, we could have told you, and we could have helped you turn it into something that's similar, but is its own unique thing. And in this case, we're just going to have to turn you down because it just doesn't work. And then they get disgruntled and they're like, well, you know, Ancerious is elitist and they don't like my ideas or whatnot. And, you know, it just seems insurmountable. You know, don't try to write yourself into prehistory without consulting other people, especially the admins. We've had people that have tried to do that before. Doesn't end well because, again, we can't have to tell them, like, no, you can't have this super giga empire that was like super powerful in the galaxy but sort of fell from grace, and, you know, only you've talked about them. Like, that's not how it works. And yeah, just sort of like, don't overhype your own stuff. I kind of like how not to hype and maintain interest is don't talk about your thing all the time. Okay? One of the things that I don't do with the Panopticon arc is talk about the Panopticon arc 24/7 or like interact it with anything else, yeah? For example, you know, people have got a massive plot, multiple plot lines going on in the Unmar Expanse, okay? Involving many different nations. And that's cool. And it's organic, and there's loads of stuff going on. I am not going to try and shove the Panopticon, or Mortal Coil, or, like, 3AW, or the Old Invaders, in any of that, even though the Old Invaders have been brought into that, because they've been asked to. I would not try to force that into anything just because I can. Like, oh, you know, more Panopticon, guys. There is such a thing as oversaturating a concept, yeah? And this is something that I am very much trying to avoid with the Army of the Panopticon and the Old Invaders, in terms of, you know, suddenly everyone is doing this thing, and, you know, it's like, well, okay, it kind of loses some of its luster if everyone is involved in this thing, or every single plot is now suddenly involved with the Panopticon. Well, that means it then stifles other storylines, and it also means that people get burnt out, because everything is to do with a particular story. And if people get burnt out, they don't want to know about the story, they don't want to be interested in that story, and they're just going to turn their brains off, okay? So if you're trying to develop a story or a concept, please don't just bring it up out of thin air, yeah? Like, don't sort of try and shove it into a conversation, okay? Try to bring it up organically, okay? If a topic moves to that sort of thing, bring it up, by all means, yeah? But don't just be like, you know, people are coming up with a cool idea, like, hey, I want to have a psionic thing going on, you know, in one of the areas of the galaxy where, you know, there's traces of this, like, weird psionic being that's going on, and, you know, I want players to come in and do psionic stuff. Like, if I then immediately jump in and go like, oh, is it to do with the Panopticon? Like, oh, let's make it to do with the Panopticon. Like, oh, the Panopticon would obviously get involved there. Like, whatever the players were going to organically come up with on their own has now been completely overridden by the Army of the Panopticon plotline, which is boring, yeah? Not everything has to be that. So, you know, if a particular subject comes up, don't instantly try and springboard into it, because it will make people go like, okay, alright, like, that was a bit random and out of nowhere. Like, I think that, like, big bads are, like, one of the things with this, is that if there's a discussion going on about a big bad, don't try and bring up another big bad, because then it just kind of, like, it kind of throws everything off, because, like, obviously we've got the Army of the Panopticon going at the moment, and then we've also got the Old Invaders, and if there's discussions about one, it kind of inevitably, the other gets brought up, but in, like, a weird way of, like, oh, well, actually the other's, like, more powerful, and it kind of gets a bit bogged down, and it's like, yeah, but that's not the point of the topic, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. Don't try to just sort of, like, force things in that way. Entice players in to learn about a particular thing. Run role plays that are about a particular thing that you want to do, yeah? And through that, you get players who are interested and hyped for it. And through that, they will then obviously talk about it to other players and be like, oh yeah, you know, I'm in this RP at the moment to do with the X thing, and, you know, it's pretty cool actually, I'm really enjoying it. And the other person's like, oh yeah, like, can you tell me a bit more? And then this spirals, and then that spirals, and then more people get interested, and blah, 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 blah. But if you're trying to, like, heap it on people or bring it up in conversation out of thin air, people are going to be like, that was a bit random, like, okay, like, I don't know why you're sort of, like, you know, screaming to the hills about this or whatnot. So that's kind of not how to go about, you know, hyping people up about things. Yeah, just sort of like isolating yourself in character and out of character is just not going to integrate anything. Again, if you're going to make stuff about Greater Ankh lore, please talk to the admins about this sort of stuff, because people can do a lot of damage inadvertently, you know, by, like, again, overloading certain things, something that I'm trying to keep a very wary eye on with the Arm in the Panopticon at the moment. So, yeah, just kind of like, but don't force it. I think this is another key thing. Like, don't force it. Don't think to yourself immediately after coming away from this discussion, like, oh, I need to make some Ankh lore. I'm going to go to the NPC sheet right away and then RNG number roller a random NPC and then decide to develop them as a faction. Like, you don't need to do that. You don't need to force it. If you've got the time, you've got the energy, you've got the ideas, and you see something on the NPC sheet and you go, oh, that's a cool idea. Or you see something in the Ankh lore and you go, oh, that's a cool idea. Ask, has it been fleshed out? No? Okay, maybe do something about it. Maybe do something like, you know, when you're not replying to RPs or, you know, doing other stuff, you know, like as a sort of like a fun side project. You don't have to, you know, main stuff. We're not forcing everyone to fill out everything, and like not every piece of Ancerios canon needs to be meticulously detailed and fleshed out, of course, having vague unknowns and sort of like semi-blank slates for people in the future to use is a very powerful way of storytelling, because there's always open plot lines. But yeah, that's kind of my advice on that front. So I guess the last thing is general questions. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? Someone is indeed typing. And yes, Dana, I love you, but I will say Death Knight Lillian was a prime example of, like, not to just sort of ram it in everywhere. And you've pulled back from that, and it's all sorted. But that was a definite example of, like, hey, a random person is doing something in Lego City. Death Knight Lillian gets involved, or, like, Death Knight Lillian wants to get involved. So yeah, that's a good example to bring up. But I'm definitely interested in what she's going to be doing in the future. Okay. What's a good way to get the most out of a Gen Dev session? Okay, so with a Gen Dev session, what you basically want to do is you want to be kind of concise immediately, to be like, right guys, I need help with the faction, or hey, I've got this idea, I've got a storyline. You basically just want to get it out there immediately, like, hey, I want to do this. You could ping any relevant people that, you know, who might have knowledge on the subject or whatnot, and you could basically say, this is what I want to do, or this is my idea, how do I do it, give me input. Let people give their input. Throw alternatives out there, throw interesting ideas, try and, like, get back and forth going, yeah? You want discourse. You don't just want it to be, like, kind of over very, very quickly. I know that can obviously happen. Like, if you just go like, hey, I've got an idea for this, does this work? And somebody goes, yes, then obviously fine. But, you know, if you want a discourse, try and get it back and forth. Try and ping pong ideas back and forth over with different people, and you'll get something out of it. A Gen Dev session doesn't have to have a particular wrap up. As long as you have got out of that Gen Dev session what you initially asked for or were interested in or wanted to know, it's a good Gen Dev session. Okay? Or as if other people have got out of that Gen Dev session what they were, like, kind of wanting to know about your idea and that, it's a good Gen Dev session. Okay? So as long as sort of that's happened, I'd consider it a victory. A bad Gen Dev session is when somebody comes and says, I've got this idea, blah, 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 pings a load of people, and either nobody responds, or somebody just goes like, I don't really like it, and that's it. And it's like, well, you know, there's nothing really to work with there. You know, think about constructive criticism whenever you're talking in Gen Devs, yeah? Sure, you can criticise, that's fine, but be constructive. If you're going to say, no, this does not work, or no, that's already happened, or no, whatever, always make sure that you offer alternatives or give alternate ways of approaching a situation. Yeah, if you're not doing that, you are not working to the spirit of gen dev. You're not trying to be cooperative. You're just there to be like, no, actually, which is, you know, not what we want. So pretty much again, like, that's what you would do. Okay, how do I find out what Ankh factions are missing / what they would need in order to give my own faction a bit of value to bring to the table? So, pretty much what I would do if you were joining and you were creating your first faction is read some of the nation sheets that are already posted in the nations channel of the server. Yeah, have a little read through, look at what people have written. Okay, now if you're creating your first faction in Ancerious, or even if you're creating a faction for the first time that's not your initial faction, you're obviously filling out the basic nation sheet. Okay, that's generally what you want to think about. Okay, as long as all the stuff on the basic nation sheet is there, you're going to be okay. Okay, and as long as you've got some plot hooks in your history and some interesting stuff in your nation that's kind of like ready to go or be acted on by other players or yourself, you're golden, in my opinion. Now, you might think to yourself, yeah, but there's probably a lot more that my nation needs to be, you know, fleshed out, and there's more that I could do, and there'll be stuff that's missing. You're right, there is. But the key to creating a faction initially is to make it a foundation, one that you can build from. Not all factions enter the galaxy and the RP with brimming to the rim with source. Yeah? Some factions discover their source later on through roleplay. Some of them only have a hint of it. Yeah? Some of them do enter it with everything that they want. But you really want to basically be like, look, here's a foundation, here's my basic nation sheet. With this, I can pretty much do whatever is required to start those initial stories. And through roleplay with other players, through participation in various plot lines and main plots, through character development, through nation development, through your own self-writing, you will then develop your nation to fill those missing aspects or things that you hadn't considered about when you were first writing the nation, or that helped reinforce or develop or maybe change the direction of your faction's special source. Yeah, a really good idea. An example of this is Novi when G2 first entered the group. Novi is very different now to where they were initially, and that has been through vigorous roleplay participation and fleshing stuff out in gen devs and working with other people. Yeah, so have a look through the nation sheets, get an idea of what people have, you know, mostly sorted out within their nation, go over the basic nation sheet, make sure that's all, like, you know, fleshed out to a decent degree. We're not asking you to write a mega essay or whatever. Please don't write a mega essay. We've got to review it. And make sure you've got all of those kind of initial plot hooks and foundations ready. And then, you know, when you're ready, anything else that needs to be filled in or is missing or whatnot, you can develop as you go. And if you really want to flesh out your nation after you've done that, you can write up the advanced nation sheet and really go into the nitty-gritty of how your nation works at a microscopic level. You know, if you really want to flesh out all of your systems and culture and everything else, you could absolutely go into detail. But those are not, like, you know, desperately needed for the roleplay. All we ask is you give yourself a good foundation to work from, and that you build from that foundation. We're not expecting you to, you know, pull back the covers and reveal a mighty fortress that's shining and made out of pure gold. Like, you know, nobody has entered Ankh. There's been a couple people, but, like, nobody really enters Ankh with that incredible level of, like, wow, okay, you're pretty much instantly ready to go, and you're instantly ready for, like, all these plots, you know? No, Big Rock did not. Someone said Big Rock made me lose brain cells. But yeah, so I hope that answers the question of sort of like, you know, how do you find out what's missing? So, and don't be afraid if there is things missing within your nation. You can always flesh them out as you go. Yeah? Any other questions? I see someone is typing, so I will give it a little bit. Blue, is there anything you wanted to add to this? I see. Excellent. Okay. How bad an idea is it creating a faction just coming onto the extra atmosphere scene? What do you mean by extra atmosphere scene? Oh, you mean like a nation literally just getting spaceflight, etc. So it's not necessarily a bad idea. I think this is, I'll sort of like go into this in a bit of detail. So you are fully able and allowed to play a nation that has either just developed FTL or is about to develop FTL. Blue is a good example of this, where his nation started out as such. However, obviously, if you are doing this start, you are putting yourself in a position where RP or development might be fairly hard. Because if you're just getting to the FTL scene, you're obviously going to be at a massive deficit in terms of technology. You're obviously going to be a massive deficit in terms of your nation knowing about the galaxy, other factions. It's kind of like having to develop everything from scratch, just like a colonial just turning up would, yeah? So you can obviously still give yourself integrations at the start, but you need to kind of like have things ready to go. So Blue, for example, had a first contact with the Union, my main nation, and through that developed FTL, gained wider acclaim in the larger galaxy, and entered the galactic scene from that direction. The Herschel Directorate, which DCOM has played, is also another nation that's only just really gained FTL spaceflight due to the Grand Empire of Capital partially subjugating their world, and them having thrown off the yoke of their oppressors, and they're now going to space with, you know, awfully crappy technology, but they've still got FTL drives and whatnot, and they're obviously developing in that sense. It can be done. I won't say that it isn't easy. Yeah? It can be quite hard to pull off, but it can be pulled off, and there's no like, oh, you can't do that, you know. So, yeah, it's just one of the ways that you can start. You've just got to think a little bit on how you want to proceed. Okay, so Blue asks, how can I find players or factions with good potential to bounce off of mine? Well, this kind of comes with the whole territory of, if you've got an idea, ask, because people who have similar ideas to you are obviously going to respond and be like, oh, well, I've got something similar to that, in which case you can start bouncing off people. You can also ask other players, like, hey, I'm doing this particular idea, who could I go to really get something helpful out of that, yeah? And they will tell you to, you know, go to a particular player. You can then ping them and be like, hey, you know, I'm new, but, you know, could we potentially talk about this particular idea or whatnot? And they'll probably go like, yeah, sure, no problem. Obviously, the admins are pretty good overall if you're wanting to bounce some potential ideas or source or whatever off, especially Victor. He may be cryptic and elusive, but he's extremely good at this sort of thing. I'm always around with my encyclopedic knowledge of Ancerious history, although it is also kind of like speaking to some sort of like dementia patient sometimes, because I can't even remember all the lore. But in finding players and factions with good potential, ask around again, ask or read the nation sheets, kind of have a look around at the nations, and just kind of you know, find out. Be proactive in how you can find these sorts of players, and they will appear and they'll come to you, and it will all sort of work out in that way. Any other questions? Forgive me, I just need to open a window because it's bloody hot in here. Curse extremely mild Decembers. see G2 is typing. I will let him say something. Oh, he's no longer typing. Alright, well, never mind. Oh, he's now typing again. G2, just speak. You're allowed to speak. Which we know. Jesus Christ. Alright. Any other particular questions from anyone? Feel free to ask them via voice if you want to. I'm not going to be offended.
What's a good way to build hype for an idea, alongside having gen devs?
G2, I already discussed that earlier.
Yeah, but I forgot.
Well then just go back and re-listen to this recording. Jesus Christ. Forgive these new people. Forgive this new people. My admins have dementia. Okay, well, oh, go on him.
Who are you?
Why are you here? Alright, well, if that's all the questions, I will leave it there for now. So thank you all for coming, and I will see you next time.